420s. Alright, so here's what we're doing with the unified. You're familiar with this, necessarily in previous, the continuance. You see very cleanly here the waterline continuity. 21 to reduce this product here, insert right before the WG in the compression. So what we're doing below the waterline, 22/7 divided by 3, is taking the third dimensional manifold. You see Bohr here, the Bohr overtone here, that expresses here, right before condensation. Black hole disapparition, condensation. Interestingly, above the third dimensional lattice manifold and below the waterline is this product here. That necessarily, if you impose, say 777/44 here, this necessarily, all this kind of back and forth, if you see here, first expresses its even 45/7. So it's a hyperdimensional disapparition. So you take that and pull it apart all ways that it's relevant, necessarily in its reduction, 8 expanded, 777 imposed over it. And look at the expanse of 88 hyperspace, the expressions of that in the previous logic regarding unified. So as we go up within a given construct manifold, harmonic expansion from a less positive state to a more positive state with continuity, there's never more than just one thing of the universe. So 88 hyperspace, 66, the third dimensional manifold layer, folds back, as it's expanding underneath the waterline of conservation, the general product continuity. And so, we see here the variance, this, to that, 80/7i over the waterline of conservation. Not the conservation waterline, let's call this the observer domain that produces perceptive novelty. The waterline of conservation is necessarily way down here, next to the G. Sorry about that. So, 54, writing carrier here with continuity. This Bohr overtone, right? It's the product of more matter from more energy produced by the observer effect, chaos effect upon the particles in question entering the black hole, and thus subsequent variance motion from the otherwise conservation of energy process. You see pi here, necessarily down there. You see 88. 88. So this would be lower, below the waterline of conservation, necessarily that line denoting E equals mc squared's very low imposition, pi below it. And hive mind creatures like ants, birds, bees, necessarily in the 88 hyperspace expansion as it hits 6654 pattern continuity replication after the 169 repeat pattern, folds back within the third dimensional lattice manifold, and the upper overtones necessarily dealing with above the waterline of conservation organisms that are non-hivic and self-self, then group self-consensus, group self as if self organisms down here, in that morphogenetic field becoming literalized harmonically with this 88 manifold lattice continuum past here, where impact with this 199.5 that is direct harmonic link too. And very interestingly, the super golden ratio and this inversion, all which ways you can put it, this having impact direct circuit induction channel to this nexus generalistically. See the other session for that, and we'll have a complete proper talk in front of a whiteboard on Monday. Maybe Sunday we'll do that. But updating the text past the hyperspace and folding it within the the reduction proper to the lowest products, so you can see the linear stack rather than the linear nonlinear amalgamation, which can be understood necessarily, but to see reality as it's kind of stacked, necessarily imperfect from its base of expression up. And so see here where we broke out the Newtonian grain. There'll be a little bracket here, necessarily maybe a more clean version of this, but within the Newtonian grain, all subatomic, atomic, and quantum nomenclature and logic for us denoted in relevance, if are relevant, within the Newtonian grain harmonic that's already necessarily in session, addressed in textual with the Google AI for general fluid dynamic harmonic ratios all the way down into quantum for everything. We'll just need to cleanly impose it on a handwritten, only that's relevant, because there's a lot that isn't. We'll address that. So you can see these, like here, divided by 10. We did the closest to it, variance subtraction, just to see the variance. And seeing the variance between, the harmonics, repeats of the third dimensional manifold, kind of lacing it, writing on 514, everything very much logically and linearly patterned past any inspection of perspective logic to describe it to be patterned in any other way. And such so much it is inherent pattern, not implied pattern as we've established it along the way. WG continuity is circuited into expansion, it just keeps replicating past its first expression here, 8448, 1232, repeats here, and necessarily do you just keep expanding numbers, right? More better? Does that mean more universe? No, it's expansion within a given construct domain. So necessarily the expansion to a certain point is irrelevant as everything is expressed itself necessarily within a given, like maximum amount of expressed numerical values, to a certain point, and you don't have to go to 20 quadrillion in harmonic expansion. As you might see a continuity of repeat pattern like this. And past this wall, necessarily, after 169 so spacious, after that 37, see the 88 impact, see the text file. You see 169 segment, and after that, within the 88 hyperspace, that continuities, very much so, it repeats 54, 66, 54, 66, denoting folding back within the three-dimensional lattice manifold with continuity, because expanding within a given construct domain. Reality is never more than one thing. So harmonic expansion. The observer effect produces more matter and energy from the same amount of matter and energy. Proper relativity is E expanded equals 22/7 over pi expanded. Both expanded. Pi denoting up to 72,600,412 spaces where impact with 22/7 occurs. and then harmonic expansion past the gravitational absolute to disapparate a particle and carry that extra energy from hearing the tree make a sound, and subsequently it fell, variant from the conservation of energy process. So if everything was just conservation of energy process, and below the waterline of E equals mc squared, there would be no motion, no three-dimensional non-terminosity. You can see how two-dimensional of an imposition E equals mc squared is, how preposterous it is. And quantum logic and nomenclature set necessarily certain facets of it relevant, and will be integrated into the Newtonian grain breakout. But operating under the reductionist E equals mc squared imposed overhead and not allowing for harmonic consideration. So when an optical device would detect, say, a photon, what is that, light? It causes a refraction concurrence like unto pi has perceived that photon, not an observer. So we'll absolutely produce a lab experiment to show variance of, well, you have to have an optical or a device to capture the particle motion variance. Sure. So you account for that. And then when the observer presents and looks at the experiment, what's the variance between its variance of particle motion? And knowing this given general fluid dynamic lattice manifold of which the particle is interferenced by, explaining quantum states in the interdomain of only E equals mc squared, allowed to understand in overhead, so it just moves around in a lower construct manifold with no harmonic understanding upon the lattice that is superimposed in the particle's behaving, because of. So what we'll do is we'll establish lab experiment of detecting device variance, and then when an observer presents into the control room and stares pointedly at it, interference lattice extraneous and extra from this, as you have to have a device that perceives the variance in photon motion variance from being perceived. Yes? So the additive variance, and then the subtractive. And then the subtractive, right? So the additive variance, then the subtractive, and that gives you the general fluid dynamic impact that the observer had on the photon. And then you compare observer domains, interdomain of the species humanoid, to establish the logic about region being necessarily way down below all of this. Not even the conservation of energy process, actually. And other observer domains of humanoid biped below the humanoid genus, and all animal kingdom at some point, in assumption of general fluid dynamic behavior paradigm, ants, birds, bees, considered, as general fluid dynamic hive mind considerations, and then the whole animal kingdom considered, and scaling them within the interdomain of the unified reduction for a full understanding of reality, not just the general fluid dynamic manifold of reality, what this necessarily is. All right, so a good sneak peek for what you'll see in a couple days.